Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Writers Podcast. I have with me a guest today who goes by the name of Ben Monroe. Hello, Ben. How are you doing?
Hey, Lou. I'm good. How are you?
Great, thank you. And you are a writer of what kind of books?
I like to call it weird fiction.
Weird
You,
fiction.
you could call it horror as well, but I tend to like weird.
Okay. And I guess we'll find out why you do in a bit. But so what's your latest book that you've got out?
So coming March 23rd is my new novel, The Seething, which is a tale of small town horror set in the mountains of Northern California.
Boy, it's got sort of a Stephen King, Dean Koontz vibe to it. So that's interesting. We'll talk about that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you're doing?
Yeah, totally. So I'm Ben Monroe, as you said, and we've discussed. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area here,
nice.
which I usually like to say is sunny California, but it's rainy and drizzly today. Here we are in the beginning of February. I've lived in the area pretty much all my life. I'm now living 3 cities down from where I grew up. I keep joking that I might retire in Santa Cruz someday if I get far enough south, but that's still in the future.
Okay.
I've been a writer and storyteller for all my life, I think. I really just started delving into fiction seriously about 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay,
and
interesting.
That's been going pretty well. I did a lot of other strange stuff before that, but
okay. You like these words, strange, weird. I'm getting a theme here. So growing up, were you an avid reader?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, my parents were both academics. My dad and mom taught at UC Berkeley, where I grew up in Berkeley. Always books around the house. I actually remember, I wish I still had it, but I remember them giving me a dictionary for a birthday present when I was probably 4 or 5 years old. My dad often talks about how he doesn't ever remember a time when I couldn't read. I'm sure there must have been at least one point when I couldn't, but I was nose in a book for years.
Okay, so what kind of books did you like to read?
I tended as a kid, anything fairy tale fantasy related when I was little. That was what I was really interested in.
Right.
And even as I got older, I read The Hobbit for the first time. I think when I was 6 years old was when I started it. It now don't get too excited. It did take me an entire year to get through the book.
Still
Big book for a 6-year-old, but
that's impressive.
And I still love that. I've read that with my kids, and I still revisit Tolkien every few years. And I can actually pinpoint the first real horror story I read. I got in a copy of a magazine called, I think it was Weird Worlds.
Okay.
It was a kids focused. Did they have the Scholastic Book Club where you were growing up?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was produced by the Scholastic Book Club, and it was kind of the Scholastic Book Club version of the old Weird Tales magazine.
Okay.
And I got that when I was probably 8 or 9 years old at a book fair.
Okay.
And it had H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Outsider, in it, which completely blew me away.
Right.
In a delayed blowing me away thing, actually. I remember, have you read The Outsider?
I probably have, but it's not. It's if it's Lovecraft.
Track it down if you get a shot. Yeah, it's Lovecraft. It's early Lovecraft. It's a ghost story. It's weird.
Okay.
And as an 8-year-old kid, I got to the denouement, the moment of the story where the thing happens. I'm like, what? Didn't make any sense at all.
Right.
And then I think I was drifting off to bed hours later when it hit me. I was like, holy moly, that's great.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Very cool.
And so, and so then, in my teen years, I was getting into, more Lovecraft. Barker, Clive Barker had just hit the scene around then. This is the mid to late 80s. So, and I was getting into King and, really getting into horror at that point.
Okay, very cool. Well, I'm glad the King name came up because one of my sister podcast I do is the Stephen King podcast. So I'm King's my favorite writer, and I'll have to share though, like you mentioned scholastic books, because that's interesting. I think I'm probably a generation older than you, but we had scholastic books in Canada too, and that was my first encounter with horror. It was a novel called The Ghost of Dibble Hollow. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but just the cover, it was like a tree, oak tree or maple tree or whatever, and a boy with a lantern is holding it, and then coming down the road is a ghost of another boy, but dressed in like very old colonial type clothes, and that cover just blew me away. And the story was fantastic as well. So it was my introduction to horror. And then, of course, later on, I think the first King book I read was The Shining, and then I quickly found all the stuff that he'd written before that, Salem's Lot and Carrie. And I've been a lifelong fan since.
Nice. Yeah, I just actually reread The Shining. I do a reread of that every few years.
Right.
Just finished it a couple of days ago. And boy, that book, it just right out the gate. It's great from page one.
Yeah. Also, a big fan of I think Dr. Sleep's pretty good too, but I'm a real big fan of Mike Flanagan's adaptation of Dr. Sleep, how he wove Kubrick's version and King's version, and I actually think he improved the Dr. Sleep story. So yeah, there's and of course we're all excited that he's doing the Dark Tower, or trying to do the Dark Tower now. So
yeah, I just read about that. Yeah, no, I agree. I remember seeing Dr. Sleep and thinking it was really interesting how he managed to make a film that serves as sequel to both the book and the movie, because as you clearly know, and without giving spoilers to anybody who might not have seen it, the book and the movie of The Shining are two fairly different beasts. At least the ending is definitely different on both.
Yeah, for sure.
And he managed to tie it all together.
Right. Okay, so you were, it sounds like horror was your favorite genre then, or is that
pretty much? Yeah.
Okay. Any other horror writers that you really like?
Oh gosh, I read so much. A huge fan of King. We could talk more about that ad nauseum, probably some other time, maybe.
Yeah. I'll have you come on the Stephen King podcast, and we could do that. That'd be fun.
Yeah, totally. I'll tell you my Stephen King journey. It was kind of funny.
Okay.
And again, I read a ton of Lovecraft growing up, and I was fortunate to be really getting into horror right at the time that Clive Barker was coming to the States and becoming a big deal. Since then, oh gosh, Robert McCammon is one I like. Ramsey Campbell, big fan. McCammon is a writer who, anybody listening to this who hasn't read McCammon, I think he doesn't get enough credit for being awesome.
Yeah, so I'm just actually currently reading his 8th Matthew Corbett book right now, The King of Shadows. So,
oh, nice. I haven't gotten into those, but I've read a bunch of his other ones.
Yeah, they're very cool. It's kind of a cross of Sherlock Holmes and James Bond in the 1700 colonials, United States. It's really, it's B stuff a little bit, but they're fun reads for sure. And there's horrific elements in them as too.
That's kind of McCammon's style. Is he makes B-grade movies that feel like, or B-grade novels that feel like A-grade. His vampire novel, They Thirst. Was a huge pile of fun.
Yeah, for sure. So back to you. You're reading horror in that, and I don't know, considering the environment you grew up, your educational background, were you focused on writing, or were you taking something totally different? Like maybe you wanted to be an engineer. I don't know.
Actually, yeah. The funny thing is, how to answer that question. So when I got out of high school, I decided I was done with school. I'm never going back to school. I hate school. Forget it.
Interesting.
Because again, my parents are both Berkeley professors, and I think that was my teenage way to stick it to them.
To rebel.
Yeah, exactly. And then a couple years later, I decided, well, no, that's kind of dumb. And so did decide to go to college and actually got a degree in cinema. So I spent 4 years studying film. My emphasis in the film program at San Francisco State was I took the writing and directing program. So I took a lot of screenwriting classes, took some creative writing classes, and other classes on mythology and folklore, just stuff I was interested in. And then a few years later, after I graduated, I started working in the local film industry and just really didn't like it. Yeah,
Hmm.
I did a few independent films. Actually, had an internship at Lucasfilm my last semester of college.
Wow.
Worked on
Mm.
some Star Wars kind of things,
Mm-hmm.
um, and slowly, started to realize what I really liked about film stuff was the storytelling. I like coming up with the ideas
Mm-hmm.
and seeing how stories flow and all that.
Right. What kind
Um,
of things were you doing?
Film wise,
Yeah.
yeah, I worked on a couple independent movies.
As
Gosh, it was
a,
as assistant director.
oh,
So
okay.
I was actually on set.
Ah.
And it really, when I was in college, I enjoyed the writing and I enjoyed
Mm-hmm.
editing. But I liked
Mm-hmm.
seeing how the different elements could come together.
Right.
Um, uh, but yeah, when I started working in the film biz, I
Mm-hmm.
just didn't enjoy it all that much. So fell back to a whole other skill set.
Mm-hmm.
In the 3-year gap between high school and college, I'd worked for a small game publishing company,
Oh, okay.
made tabletop role playing games. They
Right.
Chaosium, if you've ever heard of them, they did the Call of Cthulhu role playing game.
Okay.
Um, and so I worked on that, and I was doing editorial work there and a little bit of writing there as well.
Mm.
And so when I kind of moved away from film, those skills got me into sort of copywriting and technical writing.
Mm-hmm.
So it sort of became business writing for a few years.
Oh, okay.
And then I'm sorry, I think I got off on a tangent here,
No,
but
no, that's
eventually I came back to fiction.
okay.
So
All right. And so from a talent or a tool set point of view, did you have any creative writing fiction type background education courses or anything, or you just learned it as you did it?
Well, like I said, I did take some creative writing classes in college,
Mm-hmm.
and even after college, I would go back every once in a while. I feel like taking a writing class. I would go to the local community college and take a
Okay.
little, take a semester long class here and there.
Right.
Um, and what I realize now, after finally sitting down and just doing it, is somehow I had conflated in my head that writing is a big important thing, right? Stories are
Mm.
big and important, and I'm not good enough to do it, and I can't do it because it's too
Right.
important, and I've got to get better before I can even try. Um, and then one day I just sort of had this realization. It's like, no, just do it. you know,
It's like the
just
slogan. Yep.
just do it.
Yeah.
And even if people write me and tell me they hate my story and I'm bad for writing whatever,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you just get it done is the only way to move forward. You can't wait until you feel like you're good enough to tell the story. Tell the
Right.
best story you can right now,
Yep.
and just write the thing and get it done.
Okay. And did you start out with novels, short stories?
So I'd done a few short stories.
Uh-huh.
Let me think here. Going back, I'm looking at my shelf of books here.
Mm.
So my first novel was actually a board game tie-in, In the Belly of
Mm.
the Beast and Other Tales of Cthulhu Wars.
Okay.
Cthulhu Wars is this big strategy board game. I like to call it Risk for Weirdos. It's like it's Risk if
Right.
all your armies are Cthulhu monsters,
Mm-hmm.
Cthulhu's and evil cultists and monsters and whatever. And the publisher of that game, Peterson Entertainment, um, decided they wanted to branch off into fiction based on
Mm.
the thing.
Okay.
And so, I'm sorry, I should back up. When they did the game book, the game rules, they asked me, each army had its own little rules card, how this army works.
Okay.
And they asked me, because they knew I was interested in that kind of thing, could you write a little 500 word flash piece of fiction to go on each card to set the tone of what
Mm-hmm.
that faction's like? What is the Cthulhu faction like? What is the, I don't know, dark, slobbery, evil monster god faction like?
Mm.
And so I went back to my Lovecraft knowledge, wrote these little stories, and they liked those and said, well, these are pretty good. Could you write some short stories based on this setting as well? I'm like,
Ah.
sure, why not? So I wrote, I think 8 or a dozen, initially 8, then a dozen short stories based on each of those factions as well. So each one had its
Mm-hmm.
own tone and style, and that was fun. And then they liked those enough. They're like, hey, we really want to get the trademark for the Cthulhu Wars thing in the realm of publishing as well.
Mm.
Could you write a novel? And I just said, yes, absolutely, I can write a novel. I had no idea what I was doing. So I absolutely can do this.
Right.
And so I did it. And then eventually they packed all the things together. So the short stories
Mm.
and the novel got stuck together in one book. And so I often joke that my first novel was a copywriting gig that suffered from extreme scope creep. It just kept getting bigger and bigger.
Right.
But,
So with the novel, did they just give you carte blanche to just write what you want, or did they have certain story points they wanted you to hit, or how did that evolve?
Essentially, they sent me a copy of the game, and I played it a bunch to kind of figure out how the world works.
Right.
And they told me, so it's a post-apocalyptic Lovecraftian setting, right? And they said the only rules were it had to have Cthulhu had to show up at some point, and it did. And then they gave me the guidance of make it like Mad Max Fury Road, but with monsters.
Okay.
And I was thinking, well, okay, that's fine. Now, in my opinion, I did make it like Mad Max Fury Road with monsters. Not so much with the car chases, but with that you think that the guy is the hero the whole way through. But by the time you get to the end of the story, you find out that the girl, that the Imperator Furiosa character, is actually the hero of the story. And the guy was just tagging along and letting her tell her story.
Right. And did they like that?
They seem to. I mean, they published it, and they gave me money for it, so that was pretty good.
Right. So how did that work? Like, because this is a bit of an unusual situation. So you did this, you wrote the story based on what they gave you. Did they just accept it as it was, or did they come back and say, well, we like you to punch up this part, or this is missing, or anything like that? Or
it was basically published as is. You know, we did go through a few rounds of structural and copy edits with it, but they seemed to like the story enough that they just ran with it. So that was pretty good. And that was, you know, for me, that was really
affirming.
Exactly. That's exactly the word I was looking for. You know, it told me, with all those worries I'd had before, that writing stories is a big deal and you have to get it right. It's like, you know what? I told a good story. People liked it. It resonated. It's sold a few copies, and it has good reviews on places where they put book reviews. And then at that point, you know, I'd been bitten by the writing bug, and I've been publishing short stories. That came out in 2018.
Okay.
I've been publishing short stories pretty continuously since then. I think I've got about 3 or 4 a year in the years since then that have been published.
Okay.
As well as this new book, The Seething.
And what markets are you publishing in?
Mostly it's been in small press anthologies.
Okay.
I'm again looking at the shelf here. Yeah, a lot of small press anthologies. I haven't really delved into the magazine format yet. There seem to be so many of those out there that I'm not even really sure where to start, but I've had enough success with the anthologies. I'm continuing along with those for now.
Okay. So with your short stories, what's the process that you use for that? Like, do you have beta readers? Like, where do you get your feedback from with your stories? Or do you just put them out and everybody just likes them and you don't have to make any changes? So far it sounds pretty charmed.
Yeah, it's been kind of weird, actually. No, you know, I've had a few friends that I will show stuff to usually. You know, fairly early on. You know, usually I'll write a first draft. What do you think? And get some basic feedback, and then I'll go and polish it and punch up areas, you know, that I think need work. I'll usually, once I've written something, set it aside for at least a week or two, and then come back to it and look at it again. And any part where I start glossing over, you know, skipping lines myself, like, okay, well, clearly I need to go back and fix that up.
Oh, okay.
And even just having people to bounce ideas off of is pretty helpful.
Right. Are you part of a writers group, or?
Not specifically. I am a member of the Horror Writers Association.
Okay.
And I am pretty active in my local San Francisco Bay Area chapter here. So I've gotten to know all the people in that group.
Okay.
And we don't really have a writers group, but we definitely bounce ideas off of each other and encourage each other.
Very cool. So when did you tackle your first novel then? Your first?
Well, that would have been that Cthulhu-verse one. The Belly of the Beast. That was when and that was funny because when they.
Okay, sorry. Let me rephrase it. When did you do your first own original novel?
That's this one, The Seething.
Okay.
Coming out in March. Pretty much, yeah. When I finished the Cthulhu-verse thing, that came out, and again, like I said, I'd been bitten by the writing bug at that point. I started writing some short stories. and I had this idea had popped into my head for the Seething, and I couldn't get it out. And I realized that was bigger than a short story. If
Okay.
I tried to write that, it would not fit in the 5 to 10,000 words that most people ask for. Um, and so that one, I started working on it, and it was sort of a strategic or a tactical choice as well. I wanted to keep writing short stories to submit to anthologies to hopefully keep getting my name in books
Right.
along the road, because I knew the Seething was going to take a long time
Right.
to get
Right.
that thing finished.
Yeah,
And
that's a
so,
tried and tested formula.
yeah,
I don't know if it's as relevant today as it used to be, but because of the internet and everything. But yeah, that's the way that most writers traditionally worked up their resume to get to a novel state.
no, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, yeah, in the 2 years it took me to write the Seething, it was pretty much 2 years beginning to end.
Okay.
I was also breaking off, every couple months and writing a short story here, writing a
Oh,
short
okay.
story there. And so at some point I was actually starting to feel like, oh my gosh, I've been working on the Seething for 2 years. Why is this taking so long? My
Right.
first book took 4 or 5 months, right? Because I
Yeah.
didn't know what I was doing, to be honest.
Right.
But then at some point I added up all the lengths of all the short stories I had written, and realized I'd basically done an entire book's worth of short stories in the same time I'd written the Seething. So it was
Mm.
essentially like writing 2 books at the same time.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so who knows?
So that's interesting. Do you find writing short stories easier than writing a novel? Then that's probably a hard thing to do because you've only done one book so far. Well, one original.
Yeah, to me, I kind of look at them like running. It's a sprint versus marathon sort of
Right.
situation.
Right.
I do enjoy short stories. I have an idea. Oh, wouldn't it be fun to write something about? I had one came out last summer,
Mm-hmm.
a horror western, which was like, oh, wouldn't it be neat if if the Frankenstein monster was in the Old West, punching
Mm-hmm.
cowboys and stuff? That would be kind of fun. And and so I got 5,000 words out of that, kind of on a lark.
Mm.
Or I had another idea. It came out in an anthology a couple years ago, um, where I was just thinking about memory loss. A lot of stuff in my world was happening that was making me think about memory loss and dementia.
Mm.
Um, and I had this idea, and I realized that wouldn't be an entire novel's worth, or if it would, it was a bigger project than I really thought I could deal with. But I
Okay.
could get a short story out of it that I thought was
Right.
pretty powerful. Um,
Mm.
and so, yeah, so the short stories are the sprints. It's interesting idea, and how far can I carry this for a little bit of time?
Mm-hmm.
But the novel for me, and I'm working on a new one now. It's really more thinking, okay, how much can I tell? What can I say with this book that can really
Mm-hmm.
carry 400 pages or 300 pages, however long it comes out to?
Okay.
Because I don't want to drag out an idea for a short story over 120,000 words. I want to tell
Right.
a 120,000 word story that really deserves all those words.
Right. Right. So how do you think, or do you know, how has your writing craft changed since the first novel that you did for the gaming company versus to where you are now, or has it?
Um, I think it definitely has. I think I find myself thinking more consciously about structure and about the
Okay.
various elements, not
Hmm.
just throwing stuff at it and seeing where it goes.
Right.
Um, I do tend to be, well, I should say, I guess, I do tend to be sort of a see where it goes kind of writer.
Okay.
Um, a pantser, I
Pantser.
guess, is
Yeah.
the term we use these days.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and in fact, I think that's one of the reasons, and I didn't realize that until a few years ago. That's one of the reasons that I think I had been stymied in my writing for so long,
Mm.
um, because I would do detailed outlines
Okay.
and then lose interest.
Mm.
And at some point, I realized, well, by the time I get to the bottom of the outline, I know what happened.
Right.
I'm done with this. I've already told this story. Now I got to tell it again, but even like longer and spend more time on it. I'll forget,
Right.
move on to the next thing. So I lost interest there.
Hmm.
But now when I write, it's usually, uh, and even with the game book, I had a little bit of structure I was working with up front.
Hmm.
But now I tend to just come up with, what are some characters, what's the situation, an interesting idea, even just a visual image that I could
Okay.
hang something on,
Right.
and then just go with it.
Right. Okay. So that answers that question for me. So you are a pantser versus an outliner.
Absolutely.
So you're in the Stephen King school of writing
Yep.
versus the John Grisham, because it's interesting to hear those two guys talk. They have totally different approaches to writing. Grisham writes
Right.
down the last word of the story before he starts, whereas King says, if I did that, just wouldn't be able to finish the story. So
Right.
that's interesting.
Well, and I think it's also important for anybody who's writing to figure out which one they are,
Right.
and maybe you're one, maybe you're the other, maybe you're somewhere in the middle,
Yeah.
and realize that that's your process. That's what works
Right.
for you. Don't say, oh gosh, Stephen King says don't do an outline, so I'm not going to do an outline. If
Right.
you're an outliner, if that works for you,
Yeah.
great, go for it, do it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the, I think one of the worst pieces of advice that from on writing that King gives out is he doesn't believe in carrying a notebook around to write down ideas, because he says a notebook is where bad ideas go to die. But I think the problem is he's got those ideas in his head, and that's
Right.
his job. And he's a natural storyteller. He's not like most writers where writing is like a secondary gig, and you've got like the day-to-day stuff that you have to
Right.
focus on as well. So if you don't write down these ideas, you're going to lose them, no matter if they're good or not, because you got so much else going on in your life. So,
Oh
but
yeah.
again, that might be for different people, different things. But I know a lot of writers swear by having either a notebook or a tape recorder or something beside their bed, so if they think of something, they don't want to forget it. So,
I keep a specific. Well, I have a number of different notes, but I use the Notes app on my phone.
right.
And one of the things, maybe this sounds like product placement, but one of the things I love about my Apple, ecosystem here is that I
Mhm.
can type a note on my phone and it's
Mhm.
already sunk to my laptop by the time I get home and feel like doing some writing.
Right.
So,
Right.
and I don't have to worry about, sitting in a mud puddle and getting my notebook squishy.
Right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about your new book that got coming out this March. What's it
Yeah.
all about?
So the Seething is, at its core, it's a story about a family in a transition period.
Hmm.
Dad's lost his job. Grandpa died a couple years ago. Trying to figure out what they're going to do next. And so they go on a vacation to the dad's childhood home
Mm.
in Oro Lake, California, a little mountain town.
Mm.
Um, and when they get there, bad things start to happen.
Okay. So who's the story's protagonist? Is it the father? Is it one of the children? Or
It actually is one of the kids.
okay.
It's a multi POV story. It's basically the family, the dad, the
Mm.
mom, and the girl.
Mm-hmm.
There's another character. She's a police officer in town who starts investigating the things that are going on.
Okay.
But everything pretty much rotates around Kimmie, the teenage daughter of the family.
Okay. And is
And,
it is it a coming of age story or
no, not really. I mean,
no?
the plot of the book actually takes place over probably 2 or 3 days once they're finally up there in the mountains.
Okay.
Um, but without giving too much away, something's going on with Kimmie.
Mm-hmm.
She's kind of, it's funny. I recognize this now, having just reread The Shining. Actually, that I set her up as a kid with some special abilities.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing as blatant as Danny in The Shining, or the kid from Charlie and Firestarter.
Mm-hmm.
But Kimmie is somebody who has intuitions and hunches that tend to come true more often than not.
Okay.
And there's a thing in the forest, in the lake nearby of this town, that
Mm.
hones in on that and starts to be able to use her for his or its nefarious schemes.
Okay. Would you consider this a YA novel or all
No,
ages? No.
no.
Okay. Because
I mean,
teenage
I probably
character. I just have to check.
no. It's actually a good question. And
Yeah.
again, it's one of those funny things talking about pantsing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I started the book, I really had started it from the perspective of the dad, and the further I got into it, the more I realized, oh no, it's Kimmie. She's the important character here. Everything
Mm.
else is circling around her. Um, I mean, is it YA? No, I don't consider it a YA book.
Okay.
Not really sure 100% what the delineation there would be.
Right.
I'd let my kids read it. They're older teens,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure if how old I was when I was a teenager and the kind of stuff I was interested. I mean, I was reading, like I said, Clive Barker and Stephen King. I
Sure.
would have been into this book too, hopefully.
Right. Okay. is this a standalone, or is this going to be a series, or?
It's a standalone for now. I don't intend to publish a follow-up to this. It is part of a larger universe, for lack of a better term.
Building
The
your own
setting.
metaverse?
Yeah, well, the city of Oro Lake, where this
Uh-huh.
takes place, it's completely fictional. I made it up.
Okay.
And the characters start off in another city, El Costa, California, which again is a place I completely made up. I've written a bunch of short stories set in El Costa, so it's sort of my Castle Rock, Derry, my
Right.
Arkham, Dunwich sort of situation.
Right.
It's fun for me to imagine these places, take elements from places I've visited or been to, and make something new out of them.
Okay.
But no, I'm sorry, I tangentialized again. And in answer to your question, no, it's intended as a standalone.
Okay. But the locations are going to be the setting for a lot of your stories going forward.
Yeah. The city they start in, El Costa, where the characters leave from El Costa and go to the mountains. I've written about that a bunch of times. And most of the short stories I've written have been about there. Now that Oro Lake has come up, I've name dropped that in a couple different stories as well. So
right.
Does I come back there someday?
Okay. Does the story take place in current time?
Yep.
Okay.
It's modern set.
So one of your characters is the teenage girl. How fun was that to write, or difficult?
It was interesting. I mean, being a parent of teenagers myself, a lot of what I imagined Kimmie was watching my own kids or watching their friends, seeing how they interacted, and then thinking back to my own teenage years and interactions I've had with various people. So I hope I got her voice right. She seems like a pretty real character to me.
Okay. Did your teenagers give you any feedback?
I asked them questions a lot. They haven't read the book yet, but
Okay.
I did ask them questions about slang, and and again, a lot of it was me kind of not consciously paying attention, but just knowing them and having conversations with them and listening to them talking to their friends, and so it was interesting realizing how many of their conversations take place via text or a textual form, Discord and instant messaging chats and things.
Right.
And so that was something I incorporated in. The girl Kimmie, she texts a lot with her friends on the as opposed to calling them up and having conversations.
Okay. So did you structure the novel like to have every chapter was an alternate viewpoint, like from different characters, or do you stick with one character a couple of chapters and it just depends on the story flow?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
Sometimes it'll be one character for a couple of chapters, but it does tend to rotate through the 3 or 4 main people. And then every once in a while, when a bad thing is about to happen, we might give a chapter to somebody we haven't seen much before.
Okay.
There's a character, without spoiling anything, people die in this book. It's a horror story.
Sure.
And there's a character who appears, and I knew his death was coming. I didn't want him to be just a throwaway character. So when I got to the chapter when I knew that was gonna be his demise, it could have been a short chapter, but I dragged it out. I don't want to say dragged it out a little bit. I expanded on it.
Right.
And I got a little bit more into his head, and we got to know him more as a person. Because for me, when I was writing the thing, if somebody was going to die, if somebody was going to have an end point in the story, it doesn't really seem that interesting to me if somebody just shows up and then dies. Shows up, a monster gets them, whatever.
Yeah, it's just a red shirt. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
To me, there's more emotional resonance if we've got a little bit of an idea of who this person was, how he got to the point where he is now.
Right.
Excuse me.
Sure.
That's why I keep my water here. And then it just feels a little more emotionally impactful when they go.
Sure. Yeah, totally agree. So I'm curious, just going back a little to the teenage character versus the adult characters, since the voice for her would be different than the adults, who would tend probably to be a little more similar, I would think, just depending on their personalities. And that, did you write her part of the story in one sequence, or did you just follow the flow of the story and you were able to jump back between these different viewpoints with very little difficulty, or how did you find that?
Yeah, no, the latter for sure.
Oh,
I
okay.
wrote it chapter by chapter,
Hmm.
and just kept shifting tone a little bit. I don't think there's much tone in the writing
Okay.
changed too much. Maybe a little bit here and there. You know, I do tend to slip, or I tried to slip into the voice of the mentality of that character when I was writing their POV.
Hmm.
Um, and so, but yeah, the book was written chapter by chapter by chapter in sequence.
Okay. And you've grudgingly called it horror, but you really feel it's a weird story. And I'm curious as to why you have that distinction.
You know, I shouldn't be so down on the phrase horror. You know, I talk about it all the time. I love horror movies. I love horror books. I've been reading
Right.
horror forever. But something I've been thinking about a lot lately is my favorite horror. And you know, clearly, you know King, so you're going to
Hmm.
get this. My favorite horror is when horror is a flavoring or an element layered on top of something else. You know,
Right.
what I think that King does marvelously well is write stories about relatable people having relatable problems,
Hmm.
and then something bad happens.
Right.
Even in a situation like in Pet Cemetery, you've
Hmm.
got this family dealing with generational trauma, immediate trauma. I mean, the whole
Hmm.
book is about trauma,
Yep.
and then it gets even worse.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, when they're experiencing the worst trauma a family can have,
Hmm.
you know, and then it gets even worse from there.
Right.
Um, and so I don't know. I should probably maybe start using the phrase that my book is horror more often than I do. But yeah, I like weird because it makes the book sound, the story sound a little more unsettling. Like there's something
Hmm.
going on, and there's definitely strange and horrific elements to it.
Okay.
Um, I mean,
Maybe you're trying to start your own bookshelf space in the bookstores.
I was going to say, if you go into any bookstores that still exist, I mean,
Yeah.
I totally expect this book to be shelved if it gets there on horror, and I'd
Right.
be perfectly happy with that. You know,
Hmm. Very cool. Yeah, I think one of the attractions for not just horror, but for me, for fiction stories, depending, of course, on the genre. If it's science fiction, you know it's going to be something uh, out of this world, probably right off the bat. Though there are a fair number of science fiction stories that just like progress current technologies to the next step. But
right?
so then in those stories as well, there's this, I think King calls it hiding the seam, where you're in this world that feels real. Everything in it that you are reading, yeah, this can happen. But at a certain point, it crosses over this line into the fictional, which cannot happen. But the trick is to make that point very seamless or almost invisible to the reader. So their buy-in never wavers because they don't know exactly when it's flipped a switch and gone into this new
Right,
territory. And
right.
that sounds like what you're interested in as well.
Yeah. So M.R. James, who's a ghost story writer of many,
Hmm.
many years ago,
Right.
had his four rules of the ghost story. I'm not going to go through them all because it's only the one that's important.
Okay.
Um, but the one that he talked about was that the setting of the story had to be someplace people could actually imagine themselves being.
Right.
Um, and and so for me, and you know, a friend of mine's mentioned this before. One of the classic examples of that is actually the film Alien,
Mm.
because even though you know I couldn't really see myself being on a spaceship,
Right.
that ship they're on in Alien looks so crappy. It's so janky. You know, it looks like you could
Yeah.
have just taken a left turn in the back of the gas station and ended up what this is a drippy and chains, and
Yeah.
it doesn't seem high tech in Star Trek at all. It seems like the
Right.
kind of place that any of us could show up. It feels real, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Um, and so to me, that's what I really like when a
Mm.
horror story feels like something is intruding on the real world that we all recognize, that
Right.
we could all feel ourselves taking place in.
Hmm.
That's what I think it's really effective.
Okay. So your book is done and it's coming out in March, correct?
March 23rd. Yep.
And where will people find it?
All over the place, hopefully.
Okay. So
I know it's already up for pre-order on Amazon and Apple Books and
okay.
Barnes and Nobles, Nook. It's all the e-versions are set right now. So if you're interested, whatever your e-format of choice is, you know, look for it there. I
Okay.
know the hard copy pre-order should be coming in pretty soon.
Hmm.
You can go to my website, benmonroe.com, and probably find links to it there as they come along.
Okay.
The publisher is Bridgensgate Press, and they'll have all the info for it there as well. I think Bridgensgate Press is the .com is the website.
Okay.
But if not, just Google for Bridgensgate.
And they're a small publisher or indie publisher?
Yeah, they just started up a couple years ago, and they really hit the ground running. They've got a few dozen books out already. In fact, I think 3 or 4 of the short stories I published in the last couple of years came out in their anthologies. That's how I got to know them initially.
Okay. So
Heather and Steve, they're great to work with.
Okay, very cool. And I assume that you worked on the book first before presenting it to them, or did they know that you were working on it?
No, I had actually been working on it for a few years before I even got to know them. Well, 2 years before I got to know them. And when I started shopping it around and pitching it around, I sent it to a few agents, didn't get quite the response I hoped there. And then participated in the Twitter Pit Dark, which is a dark fiction pitch party on Twitter. It happens a couple times a year.
Cool.
And I got a few bites on that. And one of them was Bridgensgate, and they really enjoyed it when they read it. So we came up with a deal.
So this was then your real first experience with a publisher / editor? Or?
Yeah, this was really doing it from the beginning. You know, I wrote the book having no thought in my mind as to what I was going to do with it once I was done. You know, I'd start sending it out and see what happens. And that's exactly what I did. I wrote it, I polished it for a while, and sent it out, and this is what happened.
Okay, and how did you find that relationship? Was it like a more traditional writer-editor type of relationship for you? Or?
Yeah, very much so. You know, once they took on once they decided they wanted the book, contracts, yada, 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 and then started working with their editors. Went through a couple rounds, you know, a first big edit, where thankfully not too much changed. A lot of little things here and there. And a few semi-major changes took place as well, but that all went really well. And then a few rounds of copy editing. In fact, through the summer and fall, we did a few last rounds of polishing. And so, yeah, no, that seemed to be a pretty traditional.
Okay. And do you believe that the end result was a better book? I hope.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there were things that were caught that I was like, oh, wait a minute, you know, that should have been that way. Or I mixed up a few things here and there. And it definitely always better to have extra pairs of eyes on your stuff before you send it out into the world. Okay,
very cool. So this book is coming out for you now, and I believe you mentioned earlier that you're working on another one now?
Yes.
Totally separate?
Totally separate. It has nothing. Well, it's set in Al Costa. Ta-da.
Ta-da. Right.
And this one, again, it's a horror story. Let's just say it's a horror story.
Okay. Not weird.
And has nothing to do with the Seething.
Okay.
Totally standalone.
Okay. And are you on contract with your publisher for this one, or are you just still doing it on
this is
your
one
own?
I'm still just noodling on by myself at this point.
Okay, so you're not facing a deadline.
No, once it's done, I'll probably present it to Bridgensgate and see what they think of it. And if they pass on, I'll go back to the beginning and see what else happens.
Right. Do you have any thoughts of ever self-publishing?
That sounds like too much work. To be perfectly honest, it's funny because even having, you know, in my previous career, I think I mentioned I did copywriting, technical writing. I was an advertising executive for an ad company here in Oakland. You know, the Oakland Airport, Oakland Visitors Bureau. I had big accounts. I did marketing and advertising, and it's just too much work for me to want to do on my own. Okay. I really have great respect for people who can self-publish and make a go of it that way. I think it's really, really cool. But it just seems daunting to me.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's everything I had. Is there anything that hasn't come up you would like to mention at this time?
No. Thanks for having me on, Lou.
Oh, really, you're most welcome.
To you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talking about horror stories and books, mine and other people's. So
okay. Well, yeah, we'll have to pursue the idea of you coming on to the Stephen King podcast and just going full King on me.
that'd be a blast. That'd be
okay, all right, we'll have to work something out with that. So I want to thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best with your book and your future projects. And enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Absolutely, you too.
Okay, take care. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.